Najib. She is a climate justice activist and an intersectional feminist based in the UAE. Her work focuses on ensuring the leadership and meaningful participation of those at the front lines of the crisis. This is reflected in her advocacy for Fridays for Future MAPEA. As youth-led for the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice, she works with the UN Women and Generation Equality Framework to push for recognizing the intersectionality of gender equality and climate justice in the decision-making spaces as well as the grassroots level. She also organizes with the Women and Gender Constituency mobilizing for a gender-just transition. Aishka is the MENA regional lead with the Youth Climate Justice Fund. So let's welcome our speaker, Aishka Najib, to give her presentation.
So what is the current state of affairs in regards to climate change? We often talk about the climate change, the climate crisis as something that's going to happen in the distant future. But what we all need to realize is that it is the reality of today. Many of you might have come across, these memes or TikToks that has the slogan, "Flowers are blooming in Antarctica." Or maybe you have come across the headline that it is raining in the Arctic. What that goes to say is that we are currently living the dystopian reality that once was considered something that will happen in the far future. We know that the current climate crisis is an anthropogenic issue. There is no debating around it. It is human-made and it is human-related factors that is worsening the crisis as we speak. And we are in a situation where we need mitigation efforts on how we can backtrack the emissions, the global greenhouse gas emissions, as well as we need in the simultaneous moment adaptation, right? Because the climate change impacts are worsening across the globe. We are seeing, as shared in the Mentimeter, forest fires, floods, landslides, and so on, and we need adaptation. Currently, the adaptation funding gap is 5 times. We need 5 times more funding to close the adaptation funding gaps. And as the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sort of tells us that loss and damage is going to be a part of our present and it's going to be part of our future because we have unfortunately crossed many thresholds of temperature. And we're seeing all of these scenarios happen with the 1.2 degrees Celsius warming since pre-industrial levels and with 1.5 degrees Celsius overshoot in the global average temperatures annually and in the past few years that we have witnessed. And so that being said, we know that the climate crisis happened in a very unequal world. Right, that's where the climate crisis was born into, whether that's class segregation, race segregation, or global south, global north dynamic, with the majority world still being underdeveloped and having a lot of issues in terms of economic gaps as well. And it is important to realize that the climate crisis is only going to widen these gaps, whether it is climate refugees and migrants, impact of flooding and leaving a lot of more people, scattered away from their homes, or even segregation in terms of gender and who is disproportionately being impacted by the climate change. So this context being set in the fact that, we are very close to crossing 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold with the climate emergency clock ticking from 5 years to 4 years, which happened in Global Climate Emergency Day on July 22nd, as well as several other planetary boundaries have been crossed. Now, that being said, we are in a state of urgency. But how do we communicate this urgency? And when I asked the first question, in your timeline, when was the last time you heard about climate change? The sort of responses that we got, it was very few. And the type of responses we got is very concerning. So this presentation is also, from the beginning on end, is a call to action on how we can mobilize around the conversation and communication of this urgency. I want to take us for a little trip down history on how climate communications came to be. So the first strategy that they ever used was gatekeep and gaslight, as we like to call it. In the 1970s, the fossil fuel companies, the scientists that work for the fossil fuel companies were among the first to learn about the reality of global warming. And immediately as they knew about the information, their strategy was to gatekeep and gaslight people out there. And we can kind of see that in the early newspaper cuttings. So this is a newspaper cutting from 1962, where their strategy was not even to deny the fact that the climate crisis exists or that they are causing global warming. As you can see, the headline of this newspaper, it says, "Each day, Humber oil supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glaciers." At this point, they're not even denying the fact that they are causing climate crisis. And if we can go back a little bit, in 2004, when the gatekeep strategy didn't work anymore and people were getting access to information that the oil and gas industry was causing the climate crisis, they decided the next strategy would be to gaslight and delay any form of solid action. And that is when, we commonly use the term carbon footprint. So the term carbon footprint, believe it or not, was coined by the world's biggest emitter, British Petroleum. And they were the ones who introduced the concept of the carbon footprint calculator. So I'm gonna slowly shift to the slides where you can see they use the denial and delay tactic, if you can see to the left side, where they use headlines such as "what we know" and "what we don't know," unsettled signs, and titles like that to communicate about the global greenhouse gas emissions and global warming and the climate crisis in a form of delay, that this is not really happening, this is not something that we should be bothered about. And when that didn't work anymore, they shifted into the gaslighting, where they were like, what on earth is a carbon footprint? You are the ones that should reduce your footprint first before us, the biggest oil industries, even do anything about it. And then the term global warming to climate change to climate crisis. This is also something that I really want to talk to you all about. So in between this denial and delay issue, in 2003, there was Frank Luntz, a communication expert that was working for the US Republican Party during their election period, when global warming was really prominent and people started caring about global warming and how to down track this situation. And the Republican Party, in terms of the election period, they introduced the term climate change. Now, you would think why we started using the word climate change instead of global warming. Scientist community also use the word climate change because it encapsulates so much more. But the main reason why there was a shifting from using global warming to climate change, was because warming in itself has a negative connotation. So when we use global warming, it has a negative, sense to it, and that this is something that we need to work on. But climate change can be positive. Right? Change has a positive connotation to it. And this was also one of the strategy in communications, where they changed from global warming to climate change. But right now, along with the communicators, as well as activists, as well as scientists, we have been trying to move towards something that is more pressing in terms of the emergency, and that is the usage of climate crisis instead of climate change, or climate emergency instead of climate change. These words have been started to gain popularity, and that's because of the work that's been collectively done. And so that being said, this is just a trip down, history of climate communication. It's not something new. It has always existed, but it has been used in ways that does more damage than the benefit of the people and the planet. So climate change communication is all about educating, informing, warning, persuading, and mobilizing in order to solve this critical problem. And I'm gonna a few slides. So climate change coverage in media, where does this stand as of now? We all know that climate crisis now is it cannot be escaped, and we have also started using terms such as climate crisis and climate emergency, but this was still not picking up in media. It was during 2019 when, together with climate communicators and scientists, there was a campaign that was launched called #EndClimateSilence. This was when industry started to pick up coverage on the climate crisis. And this is exactly what we want journalists to do, right? People who are storytellers to do. We don't want climate crisis to be, considered as a siloed, echoed issue, but we need it to ensure that it's not existing in its own echo chambers, but it is being interconnected to other crises out there, whether that's refugee crisis, whether that's the gender crisis, or whether that is, the forms of various other socio-economical injustice that we're witnessing over there is being exacerbated by the climate crisis. So how do we tie those silos? And we're seeing more of those tied silos come up in news and media, and that is thanks to many campaigns such as the #EndClimateSilence campaign. Now, if I can give you a quick statistic, there was a study conducted by the Good Energy Playbook. I actually would recommend all of you to go check it out, where they took all of the written scripts between the years 2016 to 2020 and analyzed it. And they saw that, okay, when we're talking about climate change keywords, we're saying anything that is remotely close. So that can be like warming, the melting of the ice glaciers, the climate refugees, or any words that is remotely close. When they analyze that, only 2.8% of the scripts even mentioned keywords close to climate change. And the scripts that mention the word climate change explicitly is only 0.6%. And now this is all of the scripts between 2016 to 2020 in US media. This is extremely concerning to see how low we are on actually mainstreaming any form of communication regarding climate change. But then this, effort, we are seeing efforts from activists, especially young people, are at the forefronts of it, along with scientists and designers and curators are coming together to, ensure that the climate crisis communication is being mainstreamed. And that being said, I actually want to introduce you all to a game which is called Surviving the Century. And this game was, created in collaboration with scientists as well as activists and storytellers. And I want to give you a quick introduction about that game that you all can check out later as well. So what this game Survive the Century does is you are the chief editor of the most read newspaper globally, and you get to choose the headlines that is being covered regarding various issues. And as you change the headlines, as you change the stories you cover, there will be a meter that shows how long you can survive the century, or whether you tackle a climate related crisis or you don't. So I would really recommend all of you to go check out the sci-fi game, which we actually call Cli-Fi, which is climate fiction game called Survive the Century. And this is one of the areas that we're using to mainstream climate communication. Another format that we've been using to mainstream climate communication, I want to give you the example of the Eco newsletter. So the Eco newsletter was published by non-governmental environmental group, especially Climate Action Network, all the way back in 1972 during the Stockholm Environmental Conference. And this Eco newsletter is continued during all of the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention meetings and conferences. So it's there during the COPs, the conversation of the parties, the conference of the parties, as well as during the SPs, right, the subsidiary bodies. So what the newsletter, Eco newsletter does is it is actually, the only source of action that civil society can do, where we are able to tell the story, we're able to tell the truth, and it goes in the hands of all of the decision makers, right? All of the negotiators every day in the morning when the newspapers are distributed. And we use the titles, we use the, articles in the Eco newsletter to press buttons and push the negotiators into talking about a specific issue in a specific direction. And I can show you an example of Eco newsletter clipping from COP28. This is a clipping from COP28. We were talking about, especially if you can see, put a ring on it. That was a play of words to talk about the decision text on the just transition, because during COP28, the just transition was being negotiated, and we wanted to make sure that we leave COP28 with the decision text, and we're not, talking about just transition, one dialogue after the other without any commitment. So put a ring on it was an action and a mobilization to push the negotiators to make a decision. So this is an example of, practices that's already put in place, that even young people are at the front lines of shaping these articles. I want to actually present a video that is from two young people who are incredible videographers and documentary photographers who are at the front lines, always communicating about the climate crisis, and works with activists like me to sort of share our story. And I want to segue us into those two videos before I wrap up with the sort of calling that we cannot fight a battle that is already lost. And that's why we are in a dire need to integrate rational hope. And we want to make sure that this form of cognitive dissonance that we are seeing, where people are not able to relate to the climate crisis, where people are not able to relate to the emergency, we want to be able to do that. We want to be able to bridge these gaps using climate communications. So this is sort of a call to action for everybody in the room right now. We often see climate change maybe through a lens that, okay, this is a problem only scientists can solve, or this is a problem only, politicians and policymakers can solve. But we need to understand that the people in between who can bridge these gaps and who can actually push the stories of the front lines are communicators, are journalists, people, who are good with the camera, a phone, or maybe we spend too much time chronically online on social media, whatever it is. We need people to be able to tell stories and to be able to communicate about the climate crisis. And that is a very important role that we hold. So it's not just, politicians or scientists that can solve the climate crisis. It is us who can tell stories that can solve the climate crisis. And that being said, I will transition into two initiatives. One is the Climate Words that is led by Pamela, my friend. You can check that out. That talks about big jargons and complicated climate language made accessible in the form of stories and videos and photos. So I would really encourage you all to check out the initiative Climate Words. And you will also see a video from Marie, who is from Greenpeace, talking about how Greenpeace communicates the climate emergency, but most prominently, how she has a role to work with activists in the front lines to tell stories. So yeah, I will transition into that, and that will be the end of my presentation.
Hi, my name is Marie Jacquemin. I'm a documentary photographer and filmmaker, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do and why I do it. So I like to think of this climate action Venn diagram, right? What are you good at? What brings you joy? And what work needs to be done within the movement? If you find something that does all three, you found a pretty good spot for yourself. For me, I personally think I'm a pretty good storyteller. I'm skilled with a camera. It brings me so much joy connecting with people. And ultimately, the climate crisis needs storytellers. It needs photographers and videographers to help communicate the issues that we're facing. Strive to find where your practical skills, your passion, and your purpose intersect. Whether that's communicating very inconvenient and hard truths about the climate crisis or something else entirely. I now get to do this as my full-time job with a very established NGO, Greenpeace, as a video producer and a photographer. But I also do this in my free time by offering my skills to very inspiring friends like Aishka. If you feel like your passion in your niche might be storytelling with a camera as well, then the one piece of advice I can give you is to just capture as much as possible. You are surrounded by stories that only you can tell with heart and truth, and seek those out. A big part of that is talking to people and learning to listen for their stories. And being the recipient of somebody else's story is a big responsibility. Be a trustworthy storyteller and care about the subjects of your photos and films. There will never be enough storytellers in this movement, so come join us, come join the fight, and hopefully I'll see some of your pieces along the way.
Hello, I'm Pamela. I'm a documentary photographer and my work focuses on climate justice and gender equality. Over the past 7 years, I've been documenting the youth-led climate justice movement. I began in 2018 after noticing how the media only documented youth climate strikes when certain people were around, and misconstrued their narratives to benefit their own agenda. In 2020, the lack of international and intersectional media coverage of the climate crisis in Latin America, especially during the disappearances of environmental defenders and the ratification of the Escazú Agreement, led me to study a master's in photojournalism and co-found Latinos for Climate. In 2021, while attending COP26, Valentina and I noticed the language used was staying stuck in its science and policy niches, and very few people outside of the climate space were understanding key climate terms. At the same time, certain words were being misused and exaggerated for greenwashing and political messaging. While realizing this, we also found that climate literacy is incredibly low, but excitingly enough, increased literacy correlates directly with increased action. So with that in mind, we created Climate Words to give people the tools they need to talk about climate by curating a dictionary of words written by frontline experts. So if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to climatewords.org.
I am at the end of my presentation, and I just want to leave you all with the, questions on the fact that how will you get involved? Are you going to get involved as storytellers, communicators, or, videographers and photographers? And what are you willing to contribute to the climate movement? Because we are in urgent need of your talents and skills. And I just want to leave you all with that thought that youth are at the front lines of storytelling and setting narratives. So come join us. Thank you so much.